Have you ever really thought about what's happening when you get an allergic reaction? You know, that sneeze, that itch, it's more than just a minor annoyance. It's actually a wild story playing out inside your own body, a story about your personal defense system, a bit of deception, and a huge case of mistaken identity. So let's get into it and unravel this incredible biological mystery. Okay, think of your immune system like this super elite, highly trained security force. Its one job? To protect you from real dangers. We're talking viruses, nasty bacteria, that kind of stuff. But what if that security force had a bad day? What if it saw something totally harmless, like a speck of pollen or a piece of a peanut, and mistook it for a deadly invader, and then launched an all-out war? Well, that misguided war has a scientific name, and it's called type 1 hypersensitivity. It's basically what happens when your immune system's best intentions go completely and sometimes dangerously wrong. So let's break down exactly how this powerful, super fast reaction actually gets triggered. All right, first things first, we need to get a handle on the key players in this drama and define what we're really talking about when we use the word allergy. So here's the most important thing to get. Type 1 hypersensitivity is an immediate reaction. We're not talking about something that happens days later. This kicks off within minutes. The whole thing is orchestrated by a special kind of antibody called IgE and a type of immune cell called a mast cell. Now, you might hear it called a bunch of different things, allergy, A to B, or in the most serious cases, anaphylaxis, but they all point back to this same basic biological process. And the triggers for this whole reaction, they're called allergens. And honestly, they can be almost anything. We're talking about everyday foods like nuts and milk, stuff that's just floating around in our environment like pollen and dust mites, and yeah, even things that are supposed to help us like bee stings or drugs like penicillin. These are the harmless suspects that our overzealous security force gets so wrong. Now, an allergic reaction doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. Your body has to be primed for it first. And this all happens during a quiet, totally symptom-free stage called desensitization phase. So it all begins with the very first time you meet the allergen. Let's say you breathe in some pollen. Your immune cells check it out, process it, and then tell another group of cells, your B cells, hey, make some weapons against that. And those weapons are the IgE antibodies. But here's the really crucial part. These IgE antibodies don't just float around. They go and stick themselves all over the surface of your mast cells, basically loading them up like tiny microscopic landmines. And at this point, you feel absolutely nothing. The trap has just been quietly set. And now for the main event. What happens when that same exact allergen shows up for a second time? Well, this is the effector phase, and it's when that carefully set trap is finally sprung, with some pretty dramatic results. Okay, so that pollen is back. This time, it finds and binds directly to those IgE antibodies that are just sitting there, waiting on your mast cells. That binding action is the trigger. It signals the mast cell to, well, essentially explode. It's a process called degranulation. And when it does, it unleashes an absolute flood of powerful chemicals into your body. This is the exact moment you start feeling all those miserable symptoms. And that explosion releases a whole chemical arsenal. Think of it like a 1-2 punch. The first wave of chemicals, the primary mediators like histamine, are what cause things like swelling and start to make your airways tighten up. But then a second wave gets produced, secondary mediators like leukotrienes, and these guys are even better at constricting the airways in your lungs. It's this entire chemical cocktail that's responsible for everything we feel during an allergic reaction. So all those chemicals running rampant have very real physical consequences. The symptoms can range from something that's just plain annoying to something that's genuinely life-threatening. Let's take a look at how it all plays out. Basically, these reactions show up in two main ways. On one hand, you've got localized anaphylaxis, which you might know as A to P. This is when the reaction stays put in one area, like a stuffy nose from hay fever or hives on your skin. It's super common and often runs in families. But then on the other hand, you have systemic anaphylaxis. This is a terrifying whole-body meltdown where those chemicals cause chaos everywhere, leading to a massive drop in blood pressure and making it incredibly hard to breathe. This is an absolute no-questions-asked medical emergency. And just to give you an idea of how widespread this is, those localized allergies are unbelievably common. About 20%, that's 1/5 of the entire population deals with some kind of atopic condition. So yeah, if you've got allergies, you are definitely not alone. So you can see how this one single mechanism is the root cause of so many different conditions we've all heard of. When that reaction hits your nose and sinuses, we call it hay fever. If it happens in your lungs, it's asthma. If you eat the allergen, it can cause hives or stomach issues. And if the reaction is in the skin itself, it can show up as eczema. They're all different symptoms, but they're all driven by that exact same type 1 reaction. So, since this immune system blunder is so common, how do we actually figure out what the trigger is? And maybe more importantly, how do we get it under control? The classic way to diagnose an allergy is the skin prick test, and it's actually pretty clever. What it does is recreate that allergic reaction, but in a tiny, totally controlled way. A doctor introduces a little bit of a suspected allergen to your skin. If your mast cells in that spot are already sensitized and ready for a fight, they'll degranulate and create a small, itchy bump. We call it a wheal and flare. And that positive test tells you exactly which substance is your body's mistaken enemy. Once you've identified the allergen, the strategy for calling a truce usually involves 3 main approaches. The most obvious one is just avoidance, right? If you're allergic to peanuts, you stay away from peanuts. Another strategy is hyposensitization, which you might know as allergy shots. This tries to retrain your immune system by giving it tiny, increasing doses of the allergen over time. And finally, of course, there are drugs designed to step in and shut down that allergic cascade. And these medications are really targeted. For a severe systemic reaction, epinephrine is the absolute lifesaver. For your run-of-the-mill symptoms, antihistamines work by basically acting as a bodyguard, blocking histamine from doing its damage. Cortisone is great for reducing inflammation. And some of the newest drugs can actually prevent the IgE antibodies from ever loading onto the mast cells in the first place, so the trap never even gets set. All of this brings us to a really fascinating final thought. We have all these ways to manage and suppress the allergic reaction. But that underlying programming, the sensitization, is still fair. So the big question for the future is, can we find a way to truly reset the immune system's memory? Can we teach it that these harmless things were never a threat to begin with? It's a huge question that drives so much research and gives hope to millions. If you liked this video, then please like, comment, and subscribe.